Lithuania, 1940. A man sits alone in his consulate office at 3 in the morning, his hand cramping so violently that he can barely hold the pen. His fingers are swollen, his wrist locked in a position of permanent tension, and still he writes, visa after visa after visa. His name is Chiune Sugihara, and outside his window, hundreds of Jewish refugees press against the iron gates, their faces pale with terror, their voices a chorus of desperate pleas that never stops, not even when darkness falls. They have come from Poland, from Germany, from every corner of Europe where the Nazi war machine is grinding human lives into dust. They have heard a rumor, a whisper that travels faster than any telegram. There is a Japanese consul in Kaunas who just might, be willing to break the rules, and break them he does. Over the next 3 weeks, Sugihara will handwrite more than 30,000 transit visas, working 18 to 20 hours a day, defying direct orders from his own government, knowing full well that this act of rebellion will destroy his career, his reputation, and possibly his life. But here is the question that will haunt this story, the question that makes this moment so unbearably human. Why? Why would a mid-level diplomat from Japan, a country allied with Nazi Germany, risk everything to save people he had never met, people his government considered expendable, people the world was already beginning to forget? The answer begins not in the chaos of 1940, but in the eerie calm of 1939, when Kaunas was still a city where people believed the war might pass them by. Lithuania had declared neutrality, a fragile shield against the storm gathering on both sides. To the west, Nazi Germany had already swallowed Poland in a matter of weeks, and to the east, the Soviet Union was sharpening its own appetite for conquest. Kaunas, the temporary capital of Lithuania, sat directly in the crosshairs of two empires, and its residents moved through their days with the brittle optimism of people who refuse to believe the worst is coming. Chiune Sugihara had arrived in this city in late 1939, appointed as the Japanese vice consul, a position that was, on paper, unremarkable. His job was to monitor Soviet troop movements, to report back to Tokyo, to keep his head down and his papers in order. He was 40 years old, a career diplomat who had spent years in Manchuria and Russia, a man fluent in multiple languages, a man who understood the machinery of bureaucracy and the cost of stepping outside it. His wife Yukiko had joined him in Kaunas with their children, and together they had settled into the rhythm of diplomatic life, formal dinners, coded telegrams, the careful dance of international relations in a world that was rapidly losing its balance. But then, in June of 1940, everything collapsed. The Soviet Union, emboldened by its pact with Hitler, invaded Lithuania and absorbed it into its expanding empire. Overnight, Kaunas transformed from a neutral haven into occupied territory, and the Jewish population, already swollen with refugees from Poland, realized with cold clarity that they were trapped. The Soviets were sealing the borders, the Nazis were advancing from the west. And between these two crushing forces, there was only one sliver of hope. If they could get transit visas through Japan, they might be able to escape to other countries, to Shanghai, to the United States, to anywhere that was not here. Word spread quickly through the Jewish community that the Japanese consulate might issue these visas, and soon a crowd began to gather outside Sugihara's gates. At first, it was dozens, then hundreds, then thousands. They came with whatever documents they could scrape together, with stories of families torn apart, of neighbors dragged away in the night, of a future that had been stolen from them in a matter of months. Sugihara knew the rules. Tokyo had been explicit: do not issue visas to anyone who does not meet the strict criteria. They must have a final destination. They must have sufficient funds. They must have proper documentation. And even then, each visa required approval from the Foreign Ministry, a process that could take weeks or months, time that these refugees did not have. His superiors in Tokyo were clear in their reasoning. Japan had signed the tripartite pact with Germany and Italy, and antagonizing the Nazis by helping Jews escape was not in Japan's strategic interest. The message was unambiguous: close the gates, turn them away, let someone else deal with this problem. But Sugihara could not unsee what he had seen. He could not unhear the voices of children crying outside his window, could not ignore the mothers holding infants in the summer heat, could not pretend that following orders was the same thing as doing what was right. So he made a choice, and it was the kind of choice that cracks a life in half, dividing it into a before and an after. He cabled Tokyo 3 times, requesting permission to issue the visas. 3 times, Tokyo refused, and on the 3rd refusal, Sugihara put down the telegram, picked up his pen and began to write. He would issue the visas himself, without permission, without approval, without any guarantee that they would even be honored at the borders. He would write them by hand because there was no time to process them through official channels, and he would write them in such volume that his hand would betray him, seizing up in pain, the tendons screaming, the fingers refusing to obey. His wife Yukiko would massage his hands between sessions, working the blood back into the muscles, and then he would pick up the pen again and continue. There was no drama in this, no grand speeches or heroic declarations. There was only the repetitive, mechanical act of writing name after name after name, each one a small defiance, each one a life that might, just might, survive. And outside, the line never shortened. For every visa he signed, 10 more people arrived, their desperation a living, breathing thing that filled the air like smoke. They knew, even if they did not say it aloud, that Sugihara could not save everyone, that some would be left behind, that the gates would eventually close and the consulate would go dark and the chance would be gone forever. But they came anyway, because a chance, even a slim one, is better than no chance at all. And Sugihara kept writing, even as the Soviet authorities began pressuring him to leave, even as his own government ordered him to close the consulate and report to Berlin, even as the window of escape grew narrower with each passing hour. He wrote until his hands gave out, and then he wrote some more because stopping meant choosing who would live and who would die, and that was a choice he could not bear to make. The mechanics of survival in that summer of 1940 were brutally simple. You needed 3 things to escape Lithuania, and if you lacked even one, you were as good as dead. First, you needed a destination visa, proof that some country on the other side of the world was willing to accept you, though in practice, most nations had slammed their doors shut to Jewish refugees years earlier. Second, you needed a transit visa through Japanese territory, which meant convincing a Japanese consul to stamp your passport with permission to pass through Japan on your way to that theoretical destination. And third, you needed money, enough to bribe Soviet officials for an exit permit, enough to buy train tickets across Siberia, enough to survive weeks of travel through a world that wanted nothing to do with you. Most of the refugees gathering outside Sugihara's consulate had none of these things, or only fragments of them, and yet they came anyway, because the alternative was to sit still and wait for the knock on the door that would come in the middle of the night. The Soviet occupation had brought immediate terror, arrests, deportations to Siberian labor camps, the sudden disappearance of community leaders and intellectuals. But everyone knew this was just the prologue. The real horror was coming from the West, where the Nazi war machine was methodically erasing entire populations, and Lithuania sat directly in its path. Sugihara understood that he was not actually saving these people, not completely. A transit visa through Japan was not a guarantee of life. It was merely the first step in an impossibly complex chain of survival. The refugees would need to travel by train across the entire breadth of the Soviet Union, a journey that took weeks and required Soviet cooperation that could evaporate at any moment. They would need to cross into Japanese-controlled Manchuria, then make their way to the port cities, then find passage on ships to Shanghai or other destinations, assuming those destinations would actually accept them upon arrival. Every link in this chain could break, and most of them probably would. But Sugihara also understood something else, something that kept his hand moving across the paper, even when the pain became unbearable. A transit visa was a tool, a piece of bureaucratic currency that could be traded, forged, or manipulated. It was a starting point, a legal fiction that might be enough to convince a border guard to look the other way, or a ship captain to allow someone aboard. In the calculus of desperation, even a flimsy document was better than nothing. The line outside the consulate had its own brutal hierarchy. its own unspoken rules of who got to the front and who waited in the back. Families with small children were sometimes pushed forward by the crowd, their crying infants serving as a wordless plea for priority. Men who spoke multiple languages became informal translators, helping those who could not communicate in Japanese, Russian, or German. Women fainted in the heat, and others would drag them to the shade and fan them with whatever papers they carried, then help them back into line when they regained consciousness. There were arguments, moments when desperation turned people against each other, accusations that someone had cut the line or bribed their way forward, but mostly there was a grim solidarity, a shared understanding that they were all passengers on the same sinking ship, and fighting over deck chairs was pointless. They waited for hours, sometimes days, sleeping on the pavement, eating whatever scraps they had brought with them, and always watching the consulate door for any sign that it might open again. Inside that consulate, Sugihara had created his own assembly line of mercy. He had simplified the visa application process to its absolute minimum, stripping away every requirement that was not legally essential. He stopped verifying whether applicants actually had destination visas, stopped checking whether they had sufficient funds, stopped asking questions that would only slow down the process. His sole focus became speed. How many visas could he produce in an hour, in a day, in the dwindling time he had left before the Soviets or his own government shut him down? He taught his wife Yukiko to help with the paperwork, to fill in the routine information so he could focus solely on the signatures and stamps. He worked through meals, through nights, through the mounting pain that turned his hand into a useless claw. Other consulate staff members helped where they could, but the burden fell primarily on him, because he was the only one authorized to sign the visas, the only one whose name carried the weight of official approval. And Tokyo kept sending telegrams, each one more insistent than the last. Close the consulate, stop issuing visas, report to Berlin immediately. Sugihara ignored them all, or rather he acknowledged them, and then continued working, knowing that each hour of delay was another dozen lives potentially saved. He had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, had chosen to prioritize human life over national policy, and there would be consequences. He knew this with perfect clarity, accepted it as the price of the choice he had made. But he also knew that if he stopped now, if he obeyed orders and closed the gates, he would spend the rest of his life haunted by the faces he turned away, by the names he did not write, by the question of how many more he could have saved if he had just kept going a little longer. The breaking point came not from Tokyo but from Moscow. In late August of 1940, the Soviet authorities delivered an ultimatum that left no room for negotiation. All foreign diplomats must leave Lithuania within 48 hours. The order was absolute, non-negotiable, a bureaucratic guillotine that would sever the last remaining escape route for thousands of people still waiting outside the consulate gates. Sugihara received the notice on a Thursday afternoon, and the news spread through the refugee community with the speed of panic. 48 hours, 2 days to process a line of people that stretched for blocks, that had been growing rather than shrinking despite his relentless work pace. The math was impossible, the arithmetic of despair. Even working without sleep, even abandoning every remaining bureaucratic formality, he could not possibly write enough visas to save everyone who needed one. And yet, the alternative was to simply stop, to pack his belongings and walk away while thousands of people watched him leave, their last hope disappearing into the back of a diplomatic car. What Sugihara did in those final 48 hours transcended anything that could be called heroic, because heroism implies some element of choice, some moment of dramatic decision. What he did was more fundamental, more animal. He simply refused to stop. He wrote visas until his hand locked completely, until Yukiko had to physically pry the pen from his fingers and massage the cramping muscles back into something resembling functionality. He wrote visas while packing his belongings, while his children were being hustled into cars, while Soviet officials stood in his office demanding that he leave immediately. He wrote visas on scraps of paper when he ran out of official forms, scrawling the necessary information in handwriting that grew increasingly illegible as exhaustion and pain overwhelmed him. He threw completed visas out the window of the train as it pulled away from Kaunas station, refugees running alongside the departing cars to catch the fluttering papers. These final desperate certificates that might mean the difference between life and death. Even as the train gathered speed and the city receded into the distance, Sugihara continued to write, perched in his seat with a lap full of blank forms, his hand moving in mechanical repetition until there was nothing left to write on and no one left to receive them. The refugees who received those final visas, the ones written in haste and thrown from moving vehicles, often discovered that they were incomplete, missing stamps or signatures or crucial pieces of information. It did not matter. The document itself had become less important than what it represented. Proof that someone with official authority had acknowledged their existence, had taken the time to write their name, had certified that they were human beings worthy of consideration rather than disposable obstacles to be swept aside. Border guards who might have turned away a family with no papers sometimes accepted these hastily scrawled visas, perhaps out of confusion, perhaps out of respect for the desperation they represented, perhaps simply because the guards themselves were exhausted by the machinery of cruelty and welcomed any excuse to show mercy. The visas became talismans, magical objects that derived their power not from legal validity, but from the story they told, the story of a man who had cared enough to destroy his career for the sake of strangers. The immediate aftermath was chaos, a massive diaspora of people clutching their precious documents and attempting to navigate the impossible journey across the Soviet Union. Some succeeded, reaching Japan and then Shanghai, that strange open city where no visa was required and where tens of thousands of Jewish refugees would eventually gather in a crowded ghetto that was nevertheless preferable to the alternative. Others were stopped at borders, their visas rejected or confiscated, their brief window of hope slamming shut. Still others lost their documents to theft or accident, or traded them to smugglers in exchange for passage, or sold them to others whose need seemed greater. The visas multiplied through forgery and duplication, each copy a little less authentic than the original, but no less valuable to the person who carried it. Historians would later estimate that Sugihara's visas, both genuine and forged, ultimately saved between 6,000 and 10,000 lives, though the true number is impossible to calculate because survival in wartime is a web of contingencies, and attributing any single life to any single cause is an act of profound uncertainty. And Sugihara himself? He reported to Berlin as ordered, then spent the remainder of the war serving in various diplomatic posts, his career permanently stained by his disobedience in Kaunas. Tokyo had not forgotten his defiance, had carefully documented his refusal to follow orders, and when the war ended, he was dismissed from the Foreign Service without pension or honor. He returned to Japan in disgrace, a man who had violated the fundamental principle of bureaucratic loyalty, who had placed his personal judgment above institutional authority, who had believed that saving lives mattered more than following rules. For decades afterward, he worked in obscure jobs, selling light bulbs door to door, translating documents, living in quiet obscurity, while the world moved on and forgot what had happened in that Lithuanian summer. He never spoke about the visas, never sought recognition or redemption, because he had not done it for glory or gratitude. He had done it because when faced with an impossible choice, he had chosen to be human rather than obedient, and that choice had cost him everything. The survivors, scattered across the globe like seeds thrown into a storm, each one carrying a piece of paper with Sugihara's signature, each one following a different thread of survival through the labyrinth of war. They rode trains across the Trans-Siberian Railway, cramped into compartments designed for half their numbers, watching the endless Russian landscape roll past their windows, while Soviet guards periodically checked their documents, with expressions that ranged from indifference to suspicion. Some were pulled off the trains at random checkpoints, their visas suddenly deemed invalid by officials who had received new orders or simply wanted bribes. Others made it all the way to Vladivostok, that eastern port city where the Soviet Union touched the Pacific, only to discover that securing passage on a ship required yet another layer of bureaucratic negotiation, yet another series of payments to officials who held their fates in rubber stamps and ledger books. The journey that Sugihara's visas had promised was never guaranteed to be smooth, was never anything more than a possibility, a chance that some might convert into survival through a combination of luck, persistence, and the willingness to endure humiliation after humiliation in exchange for one more day of life. Those who made it to Japan found themselves in a country that was simultaneously allied with Nazi Germany and oddly indifferent to the Jewish refugees passing through its territory. The Japanese government had no particular love for Jews, but neither did it share Germany's genocidal obsession with their elimination. Jews were simply another category of foreigner, to be processed and monitored and moved along, provided they did not cause trouble or overstay their transit permits. The refugees lived in this strange liminal space, neither welcome nor actively persecuted, sleeping in cheap hostels in Kobe and Yokohama, while they scrambled to find ships that would take them to Shanghai, to Australia, to the Americas, to anywhere that was not occupied Europe. They sold their remaining possessions to pay for tickets, traded family heirlooms for passage, made promises to relatives they would never see again. And through it all, they carried Sugihara's visas, these documents that had already saved their lives once and might need to save them again at the next checkpoint, the next border, the next moment when an official demanded proof of their right to exist. Shanghai became the terminus for thousands of these refugees, that sprawling Chinese port city that had become an accidental sanctuary simply because it was one of the few places on Earth that required no visa for entry. The Japanese controlled the city, but had not imposed the same restrictions they enforced elsewhere, creating a bizarre pocket of relative freedom in the middle of occupied China. The refugees crowded into the Hongqiu district, a cramped ghetto where tens of thousands of Jews lived in conditions that were miserable by any standard, but paradisiacal compared to what was happening in Europe. They opened businesses, started schools, published newspapers in Yiddish and German, created a miniature European society in exile while the world burned around them. They survived on near-starvation rations, endured disease and poverty, and the constant fear that Japanese policy might change, that the gates might close, that the temporary sanctuary might transform into a trap. But they survived, which was more than could be said for the millions who had not escaped, who had not received visas, who had remained behind in Europe and been fed into the machinery of the final solution. Back in Europe, the machinery ground on with industrial efficiency. The Nazis had moved beyond ghettos and pogroms to something far more systematic, far more total. The camps at Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, and dozens of others processed human beings like raw materials, extracting their labor until they collapsed and then disposing of their bodies in ovens that ran day and night. The Jews who had remained in Lithuania, who had not made it to Sugihara's consulate in time, or who had been turned away for lack of proper documents, were among the first to be annihilated. The Nazis and their Lithuanian collaborators herded them into forests and ravines and shot them in groups, or locked them in ghettos and slowly starved them, or shipped them to the camps where they disappeared into smoke. Of the 250,000 Jews who had lived in Lithuania before the war, fewer than 10,000 survived. The rest were erased so thoroughly that entire communities vanished, without leaving even the faint outline of their existence, their synagogues destroyed, their records burned, their names forgotten by everyone except the handful who had escaped and carried those names forward into whatever future they could build. And Sugihara, living his quiet life of disgrace in post-war Japan, knew none of this. He had no way of knowing which of the people he had given visas to had survived, which had perished despite his efforts, which were living in Shanghai or Los Angeles or Tel Aviv, building new lives on the foundation of that single document he had written in a moment of desperate haste. He had disappeared into anonymity, a minor footnote in a war that had produced thousands of stories of heroism and horror, his name unknown to the survivors he had saved, his sacrifice unrecognized by the government he had served and the world he had defied. He worked his ordinary jobs, raised his children, lived the life of a man who had made a choice and accepted its consequences without complaint or regret. He did not think of himself as a hero, did not frame his actions in Kaunas as anything more than doing what obviously needed to be done when faced with people who needed help. The idea that he deserved recognition or gratitude would have struck him as absurd, because he had simply been a man with a pen and some authority, and using them to save lives had been the only logical response to an illogical situation. The silence lasted for 28 years. 28 years during which Sugihara lived as a ghost in his own country, unacknowledged and unrewarded, while the survivors he had saved built new lives in cities across the world and raised children who grew up hearing fragments of a story about a Japanese diplomat who had once done something extraordinary. The children heard about the visas, about the desperate crowds outside a consulate in a city their parents could barely pronounce, about a man whose name their parents remembered with a reverence usually reserved for religious figures. But the story remained vague, incomplete, because most of the survivors had never actually met Sugihara face to face, had only received their visas through the chaos of that final processing, and many did not even know his full name or whether he had survived the war. The story existed in pieces, scattered across continents, fragments of memory that did not coalesce into a complete picture until 1968, when a man named Yehoshua Nishri, living in Israel, decided to find the Japanese consul who had saved his life nearly 3 decades earlier. Nishri had been 16 years old when he received his visa from Sugihara, one teenager among thousands pressing against the consulate gates in Kaunas, and that piece of paper had carried him across Siberia, through Japan, and eventually to Palestine, where he had fought in the Israeli War of Independence and built a life he had never expected to have. But the memory of that summer haunted him, the image of a Japanese man writing endless visas while exhausted beyond measure, and Nishri could not shake the feeling that this story needed to be told, that the world needed to know what Sugihara had done. He began writing letters to the Japanese government, inquiring about a diplomat named Sugihara who had served in Lithuania during the war, and for months he received nothing but bureaucratic runarounds and dead ends. The foreign ministry had no record of anyone matching that description, or claimed they had no information, or simply ignored his requests. It was as if Sugihara had been erased from official history, his name deleted from the records, because acknowledging him would mean acknowledging that a Japanese diplomat had defied orders and embarrassed the government. But Nishri persisted, and eventually his letters reached someone who remembered, someone who still had access to old personnel files, someone who confirmed that yes, Chiune Sugihara had served in Kaunas and was still alive, living in obscurity in Fujisawa. The news spread through the survivor community like electricity, igniting a coordinated effort to locate Sugihara and bring him to Israel to receive the recognition he had been denied for so long. Other survivors joined the search, contributing their own memories and documents, building a case that was undeniable in its scope. This man had saved thousands of lives through an act of sustained civil disobedience that had cost him everything. In 1969, the Israeli government invited Sugihara to Jerusalem to be honored at Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial, as one of the righteous among the nations, a title reserved for non-Jews who had risked their lives to save Jews during the Holocaust. Sugihara, now 69 years old, accepted the invitation with characteristic humility, still seemingly baffled that anyone thought what he had done was worthy of special recognition. The ceremony at Yad Vashem was the moment when the scattered fragments of the story finally came together, when survivors who had carried their visas for decades stood before the man who had written them and tried to express gratitude for a gift that could not be repaid. They told him about the children they had raised, the grandchildren who existed because he had not turned them away, the entire branching futures that had grown from those 3 weeks in Kaunas. Sugihara listened with tears in his eyes, overwhelmed by the realization that his actions had echoed forward through time in ways he had never imagined, that the visas he had written in pain and haste had become the foundation for entire family trees, for lives that had flourished in ways he could not have predicted. He planted a tree on the Avenue of the Righteous, a carob tree that would grow as a living memorial to his actions, and he gave a brief speech in which he said that he had simply done what any decent person would have done when faced with suffering. He refused to accept the mantle of hero, insisted that he had merely been lucky enough to be in a position where he could help, and that the real heroes were the people who had survived, who had endured unimaginable horrors and rebuilt their lives from ashes. The recognition from Israel opened floodgates that had been sealed for decades. Suddenly, Sugihara's story was being told in newspapers, in books, in documentary films that traced the journey of the visa holders from Lithuania to Japan to their various destinations around the world. The Japanese government, embarrassed by the revelation that they had dismissed and ignored a man who had become an international symbol of moral courage, began a slow process of rehabilitation, though they never formally apologized for their treatment of him. Sugihara became a symbol of something Japan desperately wanted to claim: proof that not everyone had blindly followed orders during the war, that there had been individuals who had chosen conscience over obedience, who had recognized that some commands were too immoral to obey. But for Sugihara himself, the recognition came too late to undo the damage, too late to restore the career that had been destroyed, too late to erase the decades of obscurity and struggle. He had been vindicated, but vindication could not give him back the years he had lost, could not compensate for the price he had paid for doing what he believed was right. The mathematics of survival tell a story that numbers alone cannot capture. Of the approximately 6,000 people who received genuine visas directly from Sugihara's hand, historians estimate that roughly 40% successfully completed the journey to safety, reaching destinations where they could rebuild their shattered lives. The rest were caught in the gears of war, stopped at borders by officials who decided their documents were insufficient, or trapped when the Soviet Union entered the war against Japan and sealed the eastern escape route, or simply overwhelmed by the logistical impossibility of crossing a continent during wartime with nothing but hope and a stamped piece of paper. But those 6,000 original visas spawned thousands more through copying and forgery, creating a black market in Sugihara documents that saved additional lives in ways that can never be precisely calculated. A visa that saved one family might be traced and replicated to save 3 more. A document that got someone across one border might be sold or traded to someone else desperate for any official-looking paper that might convince a guard to look the other way. The visas took on a life beyond their original purpose, becoming currency in an underground economy of survival, where authenticity mattered less than the appearance of legitimacy. The stories of individual survivors reveal the chaos and contingency of wartime escape, the 1,000 small moments where everything could have gone wrong but somehow didn't. There was the family that made it to Vladivostok only to discover that the last ship to Japan had left the previous day, and who bribed a fishing boat captain to take them across the Sea of Japan in winter storms that nearly capsized the vessel. There was the young woman who lost her visa in a train station and spent 3 days convincing officials that she had once possessed one, showing them the faint outline where the stamp had pressed through to the page beneath, until finally a sympathetic clerk issued her a replacement. There was the man who used his visa to cross into Japanese territory and then immediately turned around and smuggled it back to his brother, who used the same document to make the same crossing a week later, both of them gambling that the border guards would not remember one face among thousands. These were not stories of heroic resistance or dramatic escapes, but rather tales of grinding persistence, of people who survived because they refused to give up, even when every rational assessment suggested that giving up was the only logical choice. Shanghai, that accidental sanctuary, became a laboratory for what survival looked like when stripped of everything except the will to continue. The Jewish refugees who crowded into Hongqiu lived in conditions that would have been considered intolerable in peacetime, families of 6 sharing single rooms, diseases spreading through overcrowded tenements, food so scarce that people survived on rice mixed with whatever scraps they could scavenge. But they built institutions, established schools where children learned Hebrew and mathematics and music, created theaters where they performed plays in languages that most Shanghai residents could not understand, published newspapers that debated politics and culture and the question of what they would do when the war finally ended. They lived in a state of permanent temporariness, knowing that Shanghai was not home and could never be home, but also knowing that it was infinitely better than the alternative they had escaped. They watched the war unfold through newspapers and letters and the occasional refugee who arrived with fresh stories of the destruction in Europe, and they understood with increasing clarity that Sugihara's visas had not just saved their lives, but had given them something more precious: time, the luxury of continued existence, while they waited to see what world would emerge from the ashes. The war in the Pacific brought new dangers to Shanghai, as American bombers targeted Japanese installations in and around the city, and the refugees found themselves caught between competing military powers, neither of which cared particularly about their welfare. The Japanese herded them into a designated area within Honshu, restricting their movement and making it even more difficult to find work or food, but stopped short of the systematic murder that was consuming European Jewry. The refugees endured air raids and starvation, and the constant uncertainty of whether Japanese policy might shift towards something more lethal, but they endured, sustained by the knowledge that every day they survived was another day their relatives in Europe did not. Letters from home stopped arriving in 1942 and 1943, and the silence was more terrifying than any news could have been, because silence meant that there was no one left to write, that the addresses they had memorized no longer corresponded to living people, but only to mass graves and crematoriums and empty buildings where entire communities had once thrived. When the war ended in August of 1945, the refugees in Shanghai faced a new problem: where to go now that the emergency was over. Palestine was the dream for many, the idea of a Jewish homeland where they would never again need visas or permission to exist, but British restrictions made immigration nearly impossible. America was the other great hope, but the quota system that had condemned so many to death during the war remained in place, and the process of securing entry could take years. Some stayed in Shanghai for months or years after the war ended, trapped in the same bureaucratic limbo that had defined their entire wartime existence, waiting for countries to decide whether they were worthy of admission. Others scattered to Australia, to South America, to Canada, to anywhere that would take them, carrying with them the memories of what they had survived and the knowledge that they owed their lives to a series of unlikely events, one of which was a Japanese diplomat who had decided that obeying orders was less important than writing visas until his hands gave out. The true scale of what Sugihara had prevented only became clear in the years after the war, when the full horror of the Holocaust was documented and the world began to understand what had happened to the Jews who had not escaped. The 9th fort near Kaunas, the same city where Sugihara had written his visas, became one of the primary killing sites in Lithuania, a place where the Nazis and their collaborators murdered tens of thousands of people in ravines and pits, their bodies buried in mass graves that would not be properly excavated and documented until decades later. The people who had stood in line outside Sugihara's consulate and been turned away, either because time ran out, or because they lacked the proper documentation, or simply because the cruel mathematics of triage meant that not everyone could be saved, were among those murdered. They had been so close to salvation, had stood within meters of the man who could have written their names on a piece of paper that might have saved them, and yet they had been left behind when the consulate closed and the trains departed, and the window of escape slammed shut forever. The survivors carried this knowledge with them, the awareness that their survival was not a matter of merit or virtue, but simply of timing and luck, and this awareness shaped everything that came after. They built memorials, established foundations, devoted themselves to ensuring that the story of the Holocaust would never be forgotten or denied, because they understood that forgetting was a form of second death, a way of erasing the people who had been murdered as thoroughly as the Nazis had tried to erase them. And central to many of these memorial efforts was the story of Sugihara, because his actions provided a counter-narrative to the dominant story of the war, proof that individuals could make choices that mattered, that bureaucracy and authority were not absolute, that it was possible to see suffering and respond with compassion rather than indifference. The survivors told his story to their children and grandchildren, enshrining it in family histories as the moment when everything changed, when death was transformed into life through the simple act of a man writing visas when he was ordered not to. But the story was incomplete without understanding what that choice had cost Sugihara himself, and the full accounting of that cost only emerged slowly, through interviews and archival research and the piecing together of a life that had been deliberately obscured. After the war ended and Japan surrendered, Sugihara was recalled from his final diplomatic posting and summoned to meet with foreign ministry officials who had very specific questions about his conduct in Lithuania. They had documentation of his repeated refusals to follow direct orders, records of the cables he had ignored, evidence that he had issued thousands of unauthorized visas in direct violation of policy. They asked him to explain himself, to justify his actions, to provide some rationale for why he had believed he had the authority to make decisions that contradicted explicit instructions from his superiors. Sugihara's response was characteristically simple. He had seen people who needed help, and he had helped them. He offered no elaborate defense, no appeal to higher principles or international law, no attempt to reframe his disobedience as anything other than what it was. He had made a choice, and he stood by it. The Foreign Ministry's response was equally straightforward. They dismissed him from service without pension or benefits, effectively declaring that his 25 years of diplomatic work had been invalidated by his actions in Kaunas. The message was clear and intentional. Loyalty to the institution was absolute, and individual moral judgment could not be permitted to override official policy, regardless of the circumstances or consequences. If diplomats were allowed to make their own decisions based on personal ethics, then the entire structure of government would collapse into chaos, with every official acting according to their own conscience rather than following the chain of command. Sugihara's dismissal was meant to serve as a warning to others, a demonstration that even actions taken with good intentions would not be tolerated if they violated the fundamental principle of obedience. And it worked, in the sense that Sugihara's story was buried within the Foreign Ministry, rarely discussed or acknowledged, treated as an embarrassing episode that reflected poorly on Japan's wartime alliances and post-war attempts to rehabilitate its international reputation. The years that followed were a study in quiet degradation. As a man who had once moved in diplomatic circles and negotiated with government officials, found himself selling light bulbs door to door in suburban neighborhoods, bowing to housewives and trying to convince them that his products were worth purchasing. He worked as a translator, as a part-time language instructor, as whatever he could find to support his family, never complaining about the dramatic reversal of fortune, never speaking publicly about what he had done in Lithuania, or suggesting that he deserved better treatment. His wife Yukiko, who had massaged his cramping hands during those frantic weeks of visa writing, stood by him through the decades of obscurity, maintaining the household and raising their children while Sugihara worked jobs that paid barely enough to survive. They lived modestly without bitterness or resentment, accepting their circumstances as the natural consequence of choices they had made together. The visas were never mentioned in their home, not because they were ashamed, but because there seemed to be nothing to say about an action that had been so obviously necessary that discussing it felt redundant, like congratulating yourself for breathing or eating, or performing any other basic function of human decency. The moment when the silence finally broke came on a January morning in 1969, when Sugihara, now living in a modest apartment in Fujisawa, received a telegram from the Israeli embassy in Tokyo informing him that he had been selected to receive one of the highest honors the state of Israel could bestow upon a non-Jew. The telegram was formal and brief, but it carried the weight of 28 years of unacknowledged sacrifice, and when Yukiko read it aloud to her husband, they both sat in stunned silence, trying to comprehend that the world had finally remembered what he had done. The invitation explained that survivors had been searching for him, that his name had been passed from one refugee community to another until someone had finally located him, that there were people in Israel who wanted to thank him for saving their lives and the lives of their children and grandchildren. Sugihara's first reaction was disbelief, not because he doubted the sincerity of the invitation, but because he genuinely did not understand why his actions warranted this kind of recognition. He had written visas. That was all. Thousands of other people had performed acts of resistance and rescue during the war, many of them far more dangerous and sustained than his own. Why should he be singled out? The journey to Jerusalem was Sugihara's first international trip since his dismissal from the Foreign Service, and it carried a strange emotional weight, a sense of returning to the world stage from which he had been exiled for so long. When his plane landed, and he was greeted by Israeli officials and survivors who had traveled from across the country to meet him, he was overwhelmed by the intensity of their gratitude, by the way grown men and women wept as they shook his hand and tried to explain what his visas had meant to them. They showed him photographs of children and grandchildren, entire family trees that had grown from the seeds he had planted in Kaunas, and they told him stories of the journeys those visas had enabled, the narrow escapes and miraculous survivals that had been made possible because a Japanese diplomat had refused to follow orders. Sugihara listened with tears streaming down his face, finally understanding for the first time the full scope of what he had done, the lives that had branched outward from those 3 weeks of frantic writing into futures he could never have imagined. The ceremony at Yad Vashem was held on a cold winter day, and Sugihara stood before a gathering of survivors and their families, Israeli officials and journalists who had come to document this moment of recognition. He was asked to speak, to explain why he had done what he did, and he struggled to find words adequate to the occasion. What could he say that would capture the desperation of that summer in Kaunas? The faces pressed against the consulate gates, the knowledge that every visa he wrote might be the difference between life and death. He spoke quietly, in simple language, saying that he had been raised to believe that all human life was precious, that his parents had taught him to help those in need regardless of their nationality or religion, and that when he saw people suffering, he could not turn away simply because his government told him to. He said that he had been fortunate to be in a position where he could help, that the real heroes were the people who had survived impossible odds, and that he hoped his actions might inspire others to choose compassion over obedience when faced with similar choices. The crowd listened in absolute silence, many of them crying openly, and when he finished speaking, the applause lasted for several minutes, wave after wave of gratitude and recognition washing over a man who had spent nearly 3 decades believing that the world had forgotten what he had done. The tree-planting ceremony that followed carried deep symbolic weight in Jewish tradition, the act of planting representing both memory and futurity, a living monument that would grow and flourish as the years passed. Sugihara knelt in the cold earth and placed a young carob tree into the ground. His hands, those same hands that had written 30,000 visas until they could barely move, now performing this final act of connection between past and present. The tree would grow on the avenue of the righteous, joining the thousands of other trees planted in honor of non-Jews who had risked their lives to save Jews during the Holocaust, and its presence would serve as a permanent reminder that individual choices matter, that one person acting with courage and compassion can alter the course of history in ways that echo forward through generations. As Sugihara patted the soil around the tree's roots, he thought about the refugees who had carried his visas across Siberia, the children who had been born because their parents had escaped, the grandchildren who would never know how close they had come to never existing at all. The news of Sugihara's recognition spread through Japan like a shockwave, forcing the country to confront an uncomfortable truth about how it had treated one of its own citizens. The media coverage was extensive and largely sympathetic, portraying Sugihara as a hero who had been unjustly punished for doing the right thing, and public opinion began to turn against the Foreign Ministry's decades-old decision to dismiss him. Pressure mounted for the government to formally apologize and restore Sugihara's reputation, though such an apology would implicitly acknowledge that the Foreign Ministry had been wrong to prioritize obedience over human life, a concession that bureaucracies are rarely willing to make. The government responded with carefully calibrated statements praising Sugihara's humanitarian actions, while avoiding any direct criticism of the officials who had dismissed him, threading a needle between recognition and accountability that satisfied no one but allowed everyone to save face. Sugihara himself seemed largely indifferent to these political maneuverings, content with the knowledge that the survivors remembered him and that his actions had mattered in ways he was only now beginning to fully understand. The final years of Sugihara's life were marked by a wave of recognition that seemed to accelerate with each passing month, as if the world were trying to compensate for the decades of neglect by overwhelming him with honors and ceremonies and requests for interviews. Universities invited him to speak, documentary filmmakers wanted to tell his story, schools were named after him, and the Japanese government, sensing the public relations value of his story, began slowly rehabilitating his reputation through carefully worded statements that praised his humanitarian actions, without explicitly acknowledging the injustice of his dismissal. Sugihara accepted these honors with characteristic humility, always redirecting attention away from himself and toward the survivors, insisting that he was merely one person among millions who had faced choices during the war, and that his decision had been neither particularly courageous nor particularly difficult. He seemed genuinely puzzled by the acclaim, as if he could not understand why the world found his actions remarkable when, from his perspective, he had simply done what any decent person would have done when confronted with suffering. But beneath the public ceremonies and the growing legend, Sugihara was grappling with more complicated emotions about what his story had become and what it revealed about human nature and institutional power. In private conversations with family members and close friends, he expressed a quiet sadness about the fact that his actions were considered exceptional rather than normal, that choosing to save lives over following orders was viewed as heroism rather than basic human decency. He worried that by celebrating him as a singular figure, people were letting themselves off the hook, treating his story as an inspiring exception rather than as an indictment of all the other diplomats and officials who had faced similar situations and chosen differently. He pointed out that there had been other consuls in other cities who could have issued visas, other bureaucrats who could have bent the rules, other people in positions of authority who could have used their power to save lives but chose not to, and that focusing on his story allowed people to avoid asking why those others had remained silent and obedient while thousands died. The question that haunted Sugihara in his final years was not whether he had made the right choice in Kaunas, because he had no doubt about that, but rather what his story said about the systems and structures that forced individuals to choose between conscience and career, between morality and institutional loyalty. He had been punished for disobedience, dismissed without pension, and forced to spend decades in obscurity, and while he accepted this as the consequence of his choice, he could not help but recognize that the punishment itself was designed to discourage others from following his example. The Foreign Ministry's message had been clear: if you prioritize human life over policy, you will pay for it, and that message had been received by generations of diplomats who learned to keep their heads down and follow orders, even when those orders were morally repugnant. Sugihara understood that his posthumous recognition might inspire individuals, but it did nothing to change the fundamental calculus that bureaucrats faced, the knowledge that disobedience would be punished, regardless of whether history later vindicated the decision. The survivors who visited him in those final years often asked him if he regretted his choice, if the cost had been too high, if he would do it again knowing what he now knew about the consequences. Sugihara's answer never varied. Of course he would do it again because the alternative was unthinkable, because he could not imagine living with himself if he had turned those people away, because some choices are so fundamental to who you are as a human being that they cease to be choices at all and become expressions of identity. He told them that the visas had cost him his career, but had given him something more valuable: the ability to sleep at night, the knowledge that when tested, he had not failed, the certainty that his life had mattered in ways that extended beyond his own existence. He never framed this in grandiose terms, never claimed to have changed the world or altered the course of history, but simply stated that he had helped some people when they needed help, and that this was enough. On July 31st, 1986, Chiune Sugihara died in a hospital in Kamakura, surrounded by his family, his body finally succumbing to the accumulated weight of 86 years of life. The news of his death was reported in newspapers around the world, and the obituaries told the story of the visas and the recognition and the quiet heroism of a man who had chosen compassion over obedience. In Israel, survivors gathered to mourn and to remember, sharing stories of the journeys his visas had enabled and the lives that had grown from those desperate weeks in Kaunas. The tree he had planted at Yad Vashem continued to grow, its branches spreading wider each year, a living memorial to a moment when one person's decision to defy authority had rippled forward through time, touching thousands of lives and creating futures that would otherwise have been extinguished before they began. And in Japan, the country that had dismissed him and ignored him for so long finally acknowledged what the rest of the world had already recognized, that Chiune Sugihara had been a true hero, not because he had done something extraordinary, but because he had done something simple and human and necessary at a time when most people chose to look away. The story of Chiune Sugihara should have ended with his death, another forgotten chapter in the vast archive of World War II heroism, but instead it has grown larger with each passing year, taking on a life that extends far beyond the historical facts of what happened in Kaunas in 1940. The visas he wrote have become symbols, artifacts that appear in museums and memorial exhibitions around the world, some of them preserved by families who carried them for decades, yellowed and creased from being folded and unfolded countless times. The ink faded, but the stamp still visible, proof that someone had cared enough to write a name when it mattered. Descendants of the survivors have formed organizations dedicated to preserving his memory and teaching his story to new generations, understanding that as the last survivors of the Holocaust die, the burden of remembering shifts to those who never experienced the events firsthand, but carry the responsibility of ensuring they are never forgotten. Schools in Japan, Israel, Lithuania, and the United States bear his name, and students learn about the summer when one man chose to write visas instead of following orders, though the lesson often focuses on his heroism rather than the more uncomfortable question of why such heroism was necessary in the first place. But the deeper legacy of Sugihara's actions lies not in the monuments or the ceremonies or the textbooks, but in the fundamental challenge his story poses to anyone who works within institutions and must navigate the tension between obedience and conscience. Every bureaucrat, every diplomat, every soldier or police officer or government official who receives an order that conflicts with their moral judgment must decide whether to be Sugihara or to be one of the thousands of other officials who followed orders and lived with the consequences. The systems we build demand loyalty and obedience, and they punish those who step outside the lines. And Sugihara's story is a reminder that sometimes the price of being a good person is sacrificing your place within those systems. This is not a comfortable lesson, because it suggests that morality and institutional success may be fundamentally incompatible, that doing the right thing often requires accepting personal cost, and that the world will not necessarily reward you for choosing conscience over career. The recognition Sugihara eventually received came too late to undo the damage, too late to restore what he had lost, and his story stands as both an inspiration and a warning about what happens to those who refuse to conform. The number of lives saved by Sugihara's visas continues to be debated by historians, with estimates ranging from 6,000 to 10,000 direct recipients, and an unknown but substantial number of additional people who survived through forged or duplicated copies of his documents. But these numbers, precise as they try to be, fail to capture the true scope of what was preserved. Not just individual lives, but entire futures, generations that would never have existed if their ancestors had been turned away from that consulate in Kaunas. Today there are tens of thousands of people walking the earth whose existence can be traced back to those 3 weeks when Sugihara wrote visas until his hands gave out, and they carry his legacy forward simply by living their lives, by having children and building careers and contributing to the world in ways both large and small. The mathematical progression is staggering. One man wrote documents that saved thousands, who gave birth to tens of thousands, who will give birth to hundreds of thousands, an ever-expanding wave of human life radiating outward from a single point of decision in the summer of 1940. The question that haunts this story, the question that makes it more than just another tale of wartime heroism, is why Sugihara's choice was so rare. There were other consuls, other officials in positions of authority, other people who could have issued visas or bent rules or used their power to save lives, and most of them chose not to. They followed orders, they cited regulations, they expressed sympathy but declined to act, and their inaction contributed to the deaths of millions. Sugihara's story forces us to confront the reality that the machinery of genocide requires not just active perpetrators, but passive collaborators, people who do nothing wrong except fail to do anything right, who maintain the systems and follow the procedures and tell themselves that they are just doing their jobs. The bureaucrats who processed deportation orders, the train conductors who transported people to death camps, the officials who stamped documents and filed paperwork and maintained the administrative infrastructure of mass murder. Most of them were not monsters or fanatics, but ordinary people who chose obedience over resistance, and Sugihara's defiance throws their compliance into sharp relief. In the end, the story of the consul who signed 30,000 visas until his hands paralyzed is not really about one man's heroism, but about a choice that every person faces in some form throughout their lives, whether to prioritize rules over people, whether to value institutional loyalty over human compassion, whether to do what is ordered or what is right when those two paths diverge. Sugihara made his choice in the most extreme circumstances imaginable, under conditions where the stakes were literally life and death. But the principle extends to every moment when we must decide whether to speak up or stay silent, whether to help or look away, whether to risk something of ourselves to benefit others or to protect our own comfort and security. His legacy is not that he was special or superhuman, but that he was ordinary, a mid-level diplomat with no particular claim to moral superiority, who simply refused to participate in a system that demanded he value bureaucratic procedure over human survival. And the uncomfortable truth his story reveals is that most of us, faced with the same choice, would probably follow orders, would cite regulations, would tell ourselves that one person cannot change the system, and would spend the rest of our lives wondering what we could have done differently if only we had been a little bit braver, a little more willing to pay the price of being human.